Chapter 4: Government and Politics in the Russian Federation. Russia in an Age of Democratization. Between 1945 and 1991, global politics was defined by intense competition between two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. The competition encompassed almost all areas of the world and affected a broad range of economic, political, social, and cultural patterns. As a result, when the Soviet Union surprisingly and suddenly collapsed in 1991, the reverberations were heard everywhere. In the wake of its demise, the component republics broke apart, leaving the Russian Federation as the largest piece, with a population cut in half, but with a land space that allowed it to remain geographically the largest country in the world. The first president of the Russian Federation was Boris Yeltsin, a former member of the Soviet Politburo, who declared the end of old Soviet-style regime. The shock therapy reforms that he advocated pointed the country in the direction of democracy and a free market economy. Yet Yeltsin was an uneven leader, often ill or under the influence of alcohol, who reverted to authoritarian rule whenever he pleased. A small group of family members and advisors effectively took control from the weakened president, and they ran the country as an oligarchy, granting themselves favors and inviting economic and political corruption. However, despite this development, a new constitution was put in place in 1993, and regular, sometimes competitive elections took place in the years that followed. A new president, Vladimir Putin, was elected in 2000 and 2004 without serious conflict, but many observers are still wary of the continuing influence of the oligarchy. Putin often acted aggressively in containing the oligarchs' political and economic powers, and followed a clear path toward increasing centralization of power. As the election of 2008 approached, he followed the Constitution of 1993 by stepping down after 2 terms, but he announced his intention to stay on as prime minister under the new president Dmitry Medvedev. Putin maintained control of the government while prime minister, and in 2012, he successfully ran for president again. Is Putin's continuing influence in policymaking a signal that Russia is again becoming an authoritarian state, and that its fling with democracy is now over? Modern Russia, then, is a very unpredictable country. Its historic roots deeply influence every area of life, and Russia has almost no experience with democracy in a free market. Is the new structure set in place during the 1990s proof that the global trend toward democratization has influenced the Russian political system? Or perhaps, is it possible that Russia is settling in as a liberal democracy, with direct elections and other democratic structures in place, but with little hope of strengthening the democratic principles of civil liberties and rights, competitive political parties, rule of law, and an independent judiciary? However, Russia's long history of autocratic rule certainly leaves open the third possibility, that democracy has little chance to survive in Russia. No one knows at this point, but Russian history and political culture leave room for all 3 paths. Slavic roots provide a strong tendency toward autocratic rule, but the desire to modernize and compete for world power has been apparent since the late 17th century, even though there is little evidence that current Russian leaders see democratization as a model for their country's political development. One way to categorize Russia is as a hybrid, a system with some characteristics of a democracy, but with some strong authoritarian tendencies as well. Although the Economist Democracy Index categorizes Russia as an authoritarian regime. Sovereignty, authority, and power. For most of the 20th century, public authority and political power emanated from one place, the Politburo of the Communist Party. The Politburo was a small group of men who climbed the ranks of the party through nomenklatura, an ordered path from local party Soviets, committees, to the commanding heights of leadership. When the Soviet Union dissolved, its authority and power vanished with it, leaving in place a new government structure with questionable legitimacy. Still, the political culture and historical traditions of Russia are firmly entrenched and have shaped the genesis of the new regime, and undoubtedly will determine the nature of its future. Legitimacy. In the earliest years of the 20th century, the legitimacy of the Russian government was at a very low ebb, partly because the regime change was so recent, and partly because the change appeared to be a drastic departure from the past. However, there was growing evidence that the system had stabilized since Vladimir Putin was first elected president in 2000, and since then, Putin and his successor, Medvedev, retreated from the democratic practices to reestablish some of the old authoritarianism from Russia's traditional political culture. Historically, political legitimacy has been based on strong autocratic rule, first by centuries of tsars, and then by the firm dictatorship of party leaders during the 20th century. Under communist rule, Marxism-Leninism provided the legitimacy base for the party, with its ideology of democratic centralism, or rule by a few instead of the many. Although it theoretically only supplemented Marxism-Leninism, Stalinism in reality changed the regime to totalitarianism, a more complete, invasive form of strongman rule, where the tsars ever were able to implement. After Stalin, two reformers, Nikita Khrushchev and Mikhail Gorbachev, tried to loosen the party's stranglehold on power, only to facilitate the downfall of the regime. In an attempt to reconstruct the country's power base, the Constitution of 1993 provided for a strong president, although the power of the position is checked by popular election and by the lower house of the legislature, the Duma. The institution of the presidency only dates to the late 1980s, but the Duma actually existed under the Tsars of the late 19th century. Yeltsin attempted to strengthen the Constitution's legitimacy by requiring a referendum by the people to endorse its acceptance. In the 1990s, the Constitution's legitimacy was seriously tested by attempted coups and intense conflict between President Yeltsin and the Duma. However, the 2000 presidential transition from Yeltsin to Putin went smoothly, an accomplishment that indicated that the Constitution is more resilient than it seemed to be during the 1990s. Under Putin's first two terms, government operations stabilized significantly, and the presidential transition from Putin to Medvedev went on without an incident. Although Putin's retention of political power as the prime minister indicated that he continued to hold the authoritarian control of the political system, as affirmed by his re-election as president in 2012. Historical influences on political traditions. Several legacies from Russian history shaped the modern political system. Absolute centralized rule. From the beginning, Russian Tsars held absolute power that they defended with brutality and force. One reason for their tyranny was geography. The Russian plain was overrun and conquered by a series of invaders, including Huns, Vikings, and Mongols. The chaos caused by these takeovers convinced Russian leaders of the importance of firm, unchallenged leadership in keeping their subjects in control. Centralized power also characterized the communist regime of the 20th century. Many observers believe that Vladimir Putin has steered the country back to this style of leadership. Extensive cultural heterogeneity. Until the 17th century, Russia was a relatively small inland culture. But even then, the numerous invasions from earlier times meant that the area was home to people of a wide cultural diversity. This cultural heterogeneity intensified as Russia rapidly expanded its borders, until by the end of the 19th century, the empire stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. Since then, the borders of Russia have been in an almost constant state of change, so that ethnicities have been split apart, thrown together with others, and then split apart again. The name Russian Federation reflects this diversity, with countless republics and autonomous regions based on ethnicity, but with borders impossible to draw along ethnic lines because of the blend and locations of people. This heterogeneity has always been a special challenge to Russian rulers. Slavophile versus Westernizer. In the mid-20th century, American diplomat George Kennan identified this conflicting set of political traditions as a major source of problems for Russia. The Slavophile, or lover of Slavs, traditionally has led to a pride in Slavic customs, language, religion, and history that causes Russia to resist outside influence. This tendency to value isolation was challenged first by Tsar Peter the Great in the late 17th and early 18th century. He used the Western model to modernize Russia with a stronger army, a navy, an infrastructure of roads and communication, a reorganized bureaucracy, and a window on the West. The window was St. Petersburg, a city built by Peter on newly conquered lands near the Baltic Sea. His efforts to build Russia's power were followed by those of Catherine the Great, of the late 18th century, so by the time of her death, Russia was a powerful major empire. However, their efforts set in place a conflict since the affection for Slavic ways did not disappear with the changes. Revolutions of the 20th century. The long autocratic rule of the Tsars suddenly and decisively came to an end in 1917, when Vladimir Lenin's Bolsheviks seized power and renamed the country the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Communist leaders replaced the Tsars, and they ruled according to socialist principles, although the tendency toward absolute centralized rule did not change. The old social classes, however, were swept away, and the new regime tried to blend elements of westernization, industrialization, economic development, and technological innovation, with those of the Slavophile, nationalism, resistance to Western culture and customs. A second revolution occurred in 1991, when the USSR dissolved and its 15 republics became independent nations. The Russian Federation, born in that year, is currently struggling to replace the old regime with a new one, although many of the former republics have settled into authoritarianism. Political culture. Russia's political culture has been shaped by its geographic setting, cultural orientation, and conflicting attitudes towards the state. Geographic setting. Geographically, Russia is the largest country in the world and encompasses many different ethnicities and climates. Its republics and regions border the Black Sea in the southwest, the Baltic Sea in the northwest, the Pacific to the east, the Arctic Ocean to the north, and China to the south. Its borders touch many other nations with vastly different political cultures and customs. Russia is also one of the coldest countries on Earth, partly because of northern latitude, and also because so many cities are inland. Ironically, for a country of its size, warm water ports are few, and its history has been shaped by the desire to conquer countries that have blocked Russian access to the sea. Russia has many natural resources, including oil, gas, and timber, but much of it is locked in frozen Siberia and very difficult to extract. However, in recent years, these resources have been developed and have fueled significant economic growth. Eastern Orthodoxy. Early in its history, Russia cast their lot with the flourishing city of Constantinople, establishing trade routes in that direction and adopting the Eastern Orthodox religion. As Constantinople's influence waned and the influence of Western Europe increased, Russia's orientation meant that it did not share the values generated by the European Renaissance, Reformation, scientific revolution, and the Enlightenment. Instead of individualism, Russians came to value a strong state that could protect them from their geographic vulnerabilities. In contrast to Russian statism, the West developed a taste for civil society, or spheres of privacy free from control by the state. Eastern Orthodoxy also was inextricably linked to the state, so the principle of separation of church and state never developed. Even when the communist state forbid its citizens to practice religion, broad acceptance of government control remained. Equality of result contrasted to equality of opportunity. The communist regime instilled in the Russian people an appreciation for equality, a value already strong in the country of peasants with similar living standards. Russian egalitarianism has survived the fall of the Soviet Union, and most Russians resent wealth and income differences. This equality of result is very different from Western equality of opportunity that sees getting ahead as a sign of initiative, hard work, and talent. As a result, the Russian political culture is not particularly conducive to development of capitalism. Skepticism about power. Despite their independence on government initiative, Russian citizens can be surprisingly hostile toward their leadership. Mikhail Gorbachev found this out when, in the late 1980s, he initiated Glasnost, a new emphasis on freedom of speech and press. As his reforms faltered, he received torrents of complaints from citizens that almost certainly contributed to the breakup of the Soviet Union. Today, surveys show that citizens have little faith in the political system, although, until recently, people seem to have more confidence in Putin than in any other individual leader or institutions. During his first 2 terms as president, Putin's approval ratings remained between 70 and 80%, and even reached almost 90% in 2008. But no other public officials have had comparable approval rates, including the governors of regions, army generals, Duma members, or the police. According to Russia's most respected polling outfit, the Levada Institute, Putin's popularity declined after the oil bust of 2008, but since 2011, his approval rating has still remained above 60%. The Russian people appear to have little confidence in non-governmental leaders, such as entrepreneurs, bankers, and media personalities. The importance of nationality. Even though cultural heterogeneity has almost always been a characteristic of the Russian political culture, people tend to categorize others based on their nationality, and they often discriminate against people based on long-held stereotypes. Russians generally admire the Baltic people for their civility and sophistication, but they sometimes express disdain for the Muslim Turkic people of Central Asia. In return, governments in those areas have passed laws discouraging Russians from remaining within their borders. Anti-Semitism was strong in Tsarist Russia, and today, some nationalists blame Jews for Russia's current problems.